Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're analyzing a really crucial default setting in public discourse and, well, in policy.
Punishment.
Punishment. When we see a behavior that's destructive or disruptive or even just undesirable, the immediate, almost emotional instinct is to reach for a heavier penalty.
It is. We want to signal seriousness, and we want to deter the action immediately.
That feels decisive.
It does. It's a completely understandable reaction, especially when the behavior feels urgent. But our mission today is to, step back from that emotional satisfaction and really analyze the actual machinery of this policy choice. We've looked through your sources to understand why relying on punishment, especially for these persistent structural behaviors, so often fails to deliver.
So let's unpack that initial appeal.
Yeah.
Right? Punishment is swift, it's clear, and it reassures the public that the government is taking a tough stance. The foundational logic is just beautifully simple. Bad behavior, you add a severe penalty, and you get a reduction in that behavior. Deterrence. Exactly. But we all know intuitively that if this simple equation always worked, we wouldn't still have these massive societal issues. So for you, the listener, where does that crisp, clear logic start to break down?
It breaks down when you mistake a really complex societal pattern for a simple administrative problem. We have to start with a fair assessment, though.
Okay.
Punishment does work, but only under very specific, very controlled circumstances.
I think that's a crucial starting point. If we're going to critique where it fails, we have to understand where the mechanism actually excels.
Absolutely.
So where are those specific boundaries? Where do penalties genuinely and effectively influence behavior?
The sources, they outline 4 non-negotiable conditions, and if a policy intervention meets all 4, the expected deterrent effect is actually pretty likely.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, the behavior has to be occasional. It can't be something deeply persistent or, habitual.
A one-off.
A one-off. Second, the people involved must have broadly similar levels of choice regarding that action.
Meaning it's a luxury, not a necessity.
Precisely. Third, enforcement has to be consistent and highly visible. You need this near certainty of being caught.
And the last one?
And finally, the cost of compliance has to be low. It has to be easy to do the right thing.
That sounds like a textbook case for, say, an administrative rule, like a parking ticket.
Exactly.
I park where I shouldn't, I get a consistent, predictable fine, and the cost of just parking legally is low. I adapt my behavior instantly. It's a simple, isolated choice.
That model works perfectly for simple transactional issues. But now contrast that successful model with the behaviors public policy usually targets.
The big stuff.
The big stuff. Long-term unemployment, drug usage patterns, or persistent, poverty-related crime.
These are fundamentally different beasts.
They are. The issues policy typically tackles. They rarely fit those 4 criteria. The targeted behaviors tend to be ongoing, often linked to these deep-seated cycles.
And crucially, they're shaped overwhelmingly by circumstance.
Yeah.
Stress, desperation, lack of opportunity.
As much as by true free choice. And the behavior is almost never uniformly distributed. It's concentrated. It's unevenly distributed across vulnerable communities.
So if you take that consistent penalty model that worked for the parking fine and you apply it to a behavior driven by, say, a lack of opportunity, the expected reduction just doesn't happen.
The structural drivers are still there.
The behavior doesn't just evaporate.
Correct. What happens instead is a system-wide phenomenon the sources call adaptation. When punishment is applied to these persistent behaviors tied to necessity or circumstance, the behavior doesn't disappear. It shapeshifts to avoid the penalty.
Adaptation, not elimination. That's the core concept. But why is this adaptation and not just defiance? Not just people ignoring the law?
Because people are rational actors, even when they're making bad choices. They seek to minimize risk and cost.
Okay.
So as penalties increase the cost of one type of behavior, people don't just stop the underlying activity. They find lower risk paths to fulfill that underlying need, whether it's money or opportunity or simply coping.
So what are the primary ways the sources show this behavior adapting as we turn up the heat with penalties?
We see 3 primary mechanisms of adaptation. First, the behavior becomes more hidden or selective.
Okay, so it goes underground.
It goes underground. Think of an illegal activity that moves from a public square into, say, specialized invitation-only digital forums. It's just harder to detect, requires more resources to find.
And is therefore less consistently enforced.
I see.
What's the second way?
Second, the behavior becomes more dependent on intermediaries.
A middleman.
Exactly. This is fascinating in regulatory environments. Instead of directly breaking a rule, an organization might use a complex legal structure, a shell company, a specialized consultant, to create a layer of abstraction.
So if the penalty hits, it hits the intermediary first.
And that protects the principal actor. It
Yeah.
makes prosecution exponentially more difficult and expensive.
That makes perfect sense. The penalty just generates complexity that only people with resources can afford to navigate.
Precisely. And that leads to the third form of adaptation, which is the most devastating.
Which is?
The behavior becomes riskier for those with the fewest alternatives. If you can't afford the legal consultants or the hidden digital infrastructure, you're forced to commit the activity in the most visible and least protected way.
This is where punishment policy just slams right into societal inequality, isn't it?
It is.
If the system has essentially created 3 ways to adapt, 2 requiring high resources and 1 requiring high personal risk, you've systemically just pushed the entire burden onto the most vulnerable.
That's the great paradox. Adaptation isn't a moral choice. It's a systemic reshuffling of risk based on socioeconomic status.
So the outcome of increasing penalties isn't better behavior across the board.
Not at all. It's the wealthy and connected finding ways around the rules, the hidden tracks, the intermediaries, while the poor and desperate absorb the risk. They become the most visible, easiest targets for enforcement.
So the increased penalties don't solve the problem, they just act as a filter that deepens existing societal fault lines.
By punishing visible vulnerability, yes.
So if adaptation just moves the problem around, who is responsible for catching it? I mean, that brings us to enforcement itself.
It does.
Because you need a massive apparatus to try and manage these shape-shifting behaviors.
You do. And we have to remember, enforcement is not a neutral, pre-programmed machine. It relies entirely on human detection, discretion, judgment, and, capacity.
And what's so fascinating here is that enforcement naturally follows the paths of least resistance.
It goes where the targets are easy to spot and process.
So let's discuss the incentives driving that system. I mean, police, regulators, agencies, they're not just enforcing laws in a vacuum. They're responding to pressure to show activity.
To justify their budgets, they need to demonstrate certainty and success, often measured in sheer volume.
And that pressure creates a demand for high throughput.
Exactly. If we look at the bureaucratic reality, throughput means achieving the maximum number of successful cases with the minimum expenditure of time and resources. It's the factory model.
And that model naturally pushes enforcement toward cases that are easier to detect, easier to process.
And crucially, more likely to result in a conviction or a successful penalty.
But isn't that just a convenient scapegoat?
Yeah.
We often hear policymakers say they're targeting the biggest offenders.
Oh, they absolutely intend to. But the structure of the reward system overrides that intent. The practical consequence is that attention just drifts. It drifts toward people who are more visible, often because they couldn't adapt to the hidden tracks, and those who are less able to contest decisions.
They can't afford time off work to go to court, or they don't know how to navigate the appeal system.
Or they just lack the legal or financial protection of influence. Precisely. The sources really emphasize that this systemizes bias.
The system itself does it.
Yes. The people absorbing the penalties are the ones least protected by time, money, or influence, simply because the bureaucratic incentives reward processing certainty over pursuing these difficult, nuanced cases against the well-adapted.
So the system rewards activity, not necessarily long-term impact or fairness.
That's it in a nutshell.
Oh, wow. Now, let's talk about the cost of just maintaining this machine. We've established punishment doesn't eliminate behavior, it just rearranges it. But it creates these vast support systems just to manage that rearrangement.
The true aggregate cost of a punishment-based policy is absolutely staggering, and it's often intentionally obscured. We're talking about massive investments in direct systems.
Policing budgets, court time, legal aid.
The construction and maintenance of prisons, probation officers, monitoring systems, endless appeals.
And that's just the visible budget line. The real devastation comes from the knock-on effects, which quietly just eat away at other public sectors.
Absolutely. We see disrupted families, which strains social subversives. We see reduced employment prospects for anyone with a record, creating lifelong dependence.
Poorer health outcomes.
Poorer physical and mental health outcomes, which strain hospitals and community health centers. And ironically, higher chances of reoffending, which just feeds the cycle right back into the direct systems.
And here's the crucial detail the sources highlight, which should genuinely shock you, the listener. These immense long-term costs. They almost never appear in the original policy announcement.
No.
A politician champions a tough-on-crime bill, but the costs building a new prison wing 5 years later, or decades of increased social support for the children of the incarcerated, that all arrives later in totally separate budgets.
And it's perpetually described as system pressure or budgetary strain.
Never as the direct, intended consequence of the policy that was announced 5 or 10 years prior.
The system effectively externalizes the cost of its own failure onto other, less visible public services.
It sounds like we've just created this incredibly expensive, self-sustaining punishment cycle that is primarily designed to show resolve, not actually solve the problem.
And that brings us to the most dangerous part, the escalation.
The escalation.
When a punishment policy is applied, and it inevitably fails to reduce the targeted behavior because the behavior has adapted or gone hidden or been pushed onto the vulnerable, the system interprets that failure not as a flaw in the policy's design,
but as insufficient resolve.
Exactly.
The conclusion is always the same.
Yeah.
Enforcement wasn't tough enough. The penalties must not be severe enough. We've been too lenient.
So the predictable response is always more punishment. Policy stops being measured against actual outcomes, like a reduction in the behavior, and starts being measured solely against resolve, the willingness to be tough.
And resolve is, structurally, extremely expensive to maintain and almost impossible to measure objectively.
It is.
This whole cycle is why the source material suggests we have to pivot entirely to a different question.
A better question.
Instead of asking the moral question, how do we stop this behavior, we need to ask this systemic question.
What actually happens when we try?
That one question changes everything.
It does, because it shifts the focus away from the policy's noble intent and squarely onto the real-world measurable consequences of its implementation across all systems.
And that framework immediately generates the sub-questions that reveal the true cost. Who adapts successfully? Who is forced to absorb the increasing risk?
Which public services, health, education, housing, which ones quietly pick up the long-term bill for all the collateral damage?
Once you frame the issue that way, the reliance on punishment looks less like a definitive solution.
And more like a very costly, structurally biased way of just rearranging harm within the existing system.
We are paying immense hidden costs merely for the feeling of decisive action.
While the underlying drivers, stress, opportunity gaps, survival remain completely untouched.
Now, to make it absolutely clear for everyone listening, this deep dive is not some naive argument against boundaries or accountability or necessary consequences.
Absolutely not. Those are non-negotiable foundations of a functioning society.
This is a targeted critique of relying on punishment as the primary, the default tool for managing persistent, structurally driven human behavior.
And when punishment is the go-to mechanism, the sources are crystal clear on the consistent outcome.
Which is?
Perpetually rising costs, systematically deeper inequality, growing complexity within the enforcement apparatus, and critically, very little measurable reduction in the targeted behavior itself.
It's an expensive perpetual treadmill that only manages the optics while moving the problem onto the least resilient parts of society. So here's a final thought for you to take away. If relying on punishment ultimately only rearranges harm and systemizes bias, what non-punishment incentives that directly address those root causes like stress or opportunity or survival, what would be required to fit the bill of that better question? Something to think about the next time you hear a policy pitch that sounds tough but lacks a clear roadmap for real long-term change.